Mandana, hello.
Hello.
Take us from last week to this week. I know you've been thinking a lot about this.
First of all, forgive any background noise because I'm somewhere where I can steal some internet.
That's okay, but speak slowly, my friend.
Sure. So I'm sorry if I'm repeating anything, as I can't listen and call in at the same time, but I was thinking that last week was quite a bit about the deconstruction and transformation of language, whereas this week is more about the deconstruction and transformation of people, of humanity. It's also a week in which I'm really aware of socioeconomics and class structure, which I think other than Loreen Niedecker in week 2, it's not something that comes up a lot in terms of the writers of the poems. So I guess my question is, does the message matter or impact us more than the form this week, in a sense? And if you'd like to talk about any of that.
All right. Such a great question. Can't wait to hear people's responses. Let's bring in some people who haven't had a chance to talk today. So let's go with Molly first. Molly, the question is, this week message seems to come back, though, of course, only in a couple cases is message more important than form. In fact, form is crucial. So maybe you could say, in response to Mandana, that this somewhat redresses the balance of the how and the what. But anyway, what are your thoughts about Mandana's question, assuming that you heard her question?
I did hear, and I think that we return to content in a little more traditional sense this week, especially with the frost. And I think that, sorry, I'm not fully formed yet this morning.
Happy to come back to you if you want to hear a few other comments
first.
Circle
back, sure.
Yeah, okay. All right, why don't we go to Erica on this? Is this a week in which Stein's mode is put in some kind of perspective, or is there a continuity from Stein and modernism forward into this more socially acute writing? Big question.
That is a big question. I mean, I think that one could look at it from the standpoint of Stein herself being engaged really deeply in form and formal innovation, as well as in the message that the action of actually doing these things to words and to form puts forth. Like, she's democratizing language through creating a sense of the continuous present. And I do think that that resonates with some of the poems of this week, although, you know, it's certainly very different if you look at the context and the biographical details of the poets that we're looking at this year. You know, Stein is writing from a different subject position. So while she is doing things that I think are actively trying to change the way that we deal with the structure of language, I don't know if she's conveying as much of a concrete message as some of the writers of this week are.
Mm-hmm. If we look at, well, I want to be sure to turn back to Molly, but I think I'll also ask Emily to comment on this question, and Carlos, I think. If we look at a poem, one of the tender buttons, such as A Long Dress, which seems to be pulling the curtain back on the means of production of a fashion aesthetic, and the line, which is a metapoetic word. Then we see, Stein was not even close to being an actual Marxist, but there are questions about means of production and consciousness about what's behind language that I think all of us would deem political, and then in the Dickinsonian way. So I guess the question becomes, how do you want your politics in a time of urgency? In the 1930s, you generally are sympathetic to poets who are working with form in order to get some political action done that you like. So McKay suggesting that the cops just standing by as citizens get beaten up and killed is something we need to stop. Or Ruth Lechleitner talking about the horrible paradoxes of anti-abortion, or the absence of reproductive rights. But surely the message of ModPo is that there's more continuity than discontinuity, as the concept of making form work with content is something that these poets derive from their forebears. How do you feel, Erica, about that? The apparent discontinuity that the communists and some of the Harlem Renaissance poets would have shouted out, like "Down with Stein," the communist poets said, not would say, but actually said. Were they misreading Stein, or will you give them enough to say, yeah, Stein wasn't exactly their cup of tea?
That's a really hard question.
I know, I ask hard questions. I thought about this a lot because I read a whole book about this problem.
Yeah, I want to figure out a way to elegantly need to think about this more, but my impulse is that Stein living in Paris, kind of doing Stein, it's just a different thing, right? Like, I understand completely why the communist poets were not a fan of Stein. They were doing something that was different. They were in a different geographic place, in a different socioeconomic and political situation.
And a different generation.
Yeah, a different time.
But throw Dickinson into the mix, right? If you throw Dickinson into the mix, it's pretty hard after all the valorizing of Dickinson's ability to create power in a constrained female domestic space. How can we give up that as politics when suddenly unemployment is 36%? And there are more urgent questions. Are there more urgent questions than the ability of a woman in that situation to create power from her own resources? What a loaded question that is. Obviously, the answer is there's different kinds of politics.
Yeah, I also think that the way that people were reading Stein didn't fully develop until well after she was dead.
That's right. All right, I promise to go back to Molly and then Emily and Carlos, and then we'll move on to another topic. Molly, what are your thoughts at this point? You mentioned Frost, who's a conservative. He voted against the New Deal. He preferred the wall. I think he preferred the wall. I don't know about the speaker, but I think I would prejudicially say that Frost really liked the wall because he thought that made the poem. Do we want to get into the right to the conservative response to this political thing? You don't have to.
Yeah, no, I'm not thinking so much about Frost. I guess I'm thinking more about, you mentioned the word urgency and the immediate shock value of the use of the form of some of this week's poets, the Cullen and the Lines for an Abortionist Office. And I just wonder about a return to efficacy a little bit, where with Stein, we're so theoretical and so intellectual, and this week we come back to something that's a little bit more, almost accessible.
Yes, efficacious, efficacy, such an important term, and so good here in this context. I just would like to throw in, Emily, that when you get to a poem that many of us have declared to be perfect, which is in the Harlem Renaissance tradition but is later, Gwendolyn Brooks understood modernism, and that poem, Boy Breaking Glass, shatters the form and language, is shattered, and it does exactly what we've been saying in the modernist weeks a poem should do. A poem should not be unself-conscious about the formal ways in which the poet can actually do what the poem says. That is a poem that defies the categories separating chapter 2 from chapter 3 through 6. Emily, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think the question of does this unit return to content? In some ways, certainly, and the kind of main question is it all right for content to separate so easily from form? And in this case, it does. You can kind of extract the content and also forget about the content, as Al mentioned earlier this week when I think it was Winston Churchill who read Claude McKay.
On the BBC during World War II, allegedly. There's no recording of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. To rally not African Americans to fight back against the corrupt police, but to rally the British citizens, mostly white, to fight fascism.
Right. And so, clearly I think, we know that there is a lot of formal concern and kind of reclaiming these older forms, these forms with a kind of robust, venerable, and necessarily white tradition, and using them to articulate an experience of horror or to resist a certain type of degradation. The problem, though, is does that formal concern go far enough if the content cannot just be separated, but kind of discarded in the case of that Churchill reading?
Right. Very well put. Carlos, your final thought on this, and then I want to turn to the phone.
Yeah, so my thought, I guess, is sort of similar to Emily's. I can't tell if it's a twist or not, but I sort of think that this week's poets twist Stein and take her in a new direction. So Stein, if I think of Stein as sort of using form to walk language into new areas, to sort of break semantic meaning and context, then I think of this week's poets as using language to walk forms into new contexts.
Right.
So that sort of what you were talking about, that these older forms are being breathed into with contexts and language and scenes that they wouldn't normally have in them.